Hello everybody, Spartan Robot Guy here. Just wanted to take a quick moment and thank you guys for clicking on my video. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider liking and subscribing. Helps with the algorithm, helps me to continue growing my channel, and everybody gets some really fantastic ongoing banjo content. Anyway, here's on to the video. Thanks again. Hey everybody, this is Spartan Robot Guy again, and once again, going to be doing some more Banjo-Tooie rankings. This time around I had a lot more trouble though, because frankly looking at the 8 worlds in Banjo-Tooie, none of them stand out as being particularly bad. There's honestly some that I like more than others, but this wasn't like the boss battles wherein there were severe design flaws, for example. So this list was quite a bit harder to make. And I feel like once again this might just be taken as a hot take because some of my opinions may not be as popular as others, at least within the community. Anyway, making this particular list, I actually saw quite a few patterns in terms of what made certain levels better than other levels. One of the big things that includes is the overall difficulty. Most of the levels have a very natural and a very organic difficulty progression where the levels feel just a bit more challenging with each passing level, but a few of them there is a bit of a difficulty spike, and to me that diminished the overall quality of the level. Another common thing that I saw was the creativity. Again, one of the things that always sets the banjo games apart from their contemporaries was the amount of originality. You know, some of these levels feel like, for lack of a better term, a bit of an acid trip, and that's definitely something I take into account. The more creative they are, the better they feel overall, and the better they fit with the banjo branding. And the final thing is just the overall quality of the puzzles. You know, some of the puzzles in the game feel very tedious, some of them feel very satisfying, and some of them feel infuriating. And the overall quality of the puzzles within a level is a huge factor in terms of where they wound up on the list. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. Number 8, Jolly Roger's Lagoon. I gotta be honest, this level is not a bad level, and that's something that made this ranking list so difficult, is that none of these levels are inherently broken. But there's just a lot of issues I take personally with Jolly Roger's Lagoon. The first 3 levels of the game, Mayahem Temple, Glitter Gulch Mine, and Witchy World, had a very natural progression to their difficulty, where they felt progressively more challenging. But then with Jolly Roger's Lagoon, there's this huge difficulty spike. And it isn't because of the puzzles, it's just because of the design of the level. The underwater sequences are this really complicated and really tedious maze. It's not made any better by the fact that you have to find a way to get around these octopuses, or these octopi, where you have to freeze them with a very particular, very well-placed ice shot. And to me, that just takes away from the overall experience, because going from one point to another becomes such a hassle. Something as simple as moving around the level becomes a major challenge. The puzzles are fine, the boss battle is my least favorite also, but overall, just when the sheer act of getting from point A to point B becomes such a logistical hassle, it takes away from the overall experience of the level. I also have to say that it feels a little cliche. You know, the pirate underwater theme has been done to death in video games, even at that point. You know, Mario 64 had several underwater levels, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask both had an underwater level. Like, this notion of underwater pirate-esque themes had already been overdone. Even Banjo-Kazooie had several water-themed levels. I mean, just look at the parallels between Jolly Roger's Lagoon and Treasure Trove Cove in the first game. There's just too many cliches, and that's the worst thing you could say about a banjo game, is a lack of originality. So, as such, between just how tedious moving around the level is and the lack of originality, Jolly Roger's Lagoon takes a spot at number 8. Number 7 was a tricky pick for me, but at the end of the day, it's gotta go to Cloud Cuckoo Land. I have nothing against the level itself. The puzzles are a little tricky, the boss battle is really cool, but the biggest issue I have with this level is just the lack of focus. Like, what exactly is the theme in this level? It almost feels like they took a whole bunch of smaller ideas they had and kind of threw them all in one place just to create one more world. You know, for example, there's magical themes, there's an exercise minigame, there's the rematch with Canary Mary, which is an absolute no in my book. I cannot stand that particular puzzle. It just, like I said in a previous video, it feels like an acid trip. You know, you go between a jello castle to fighting eyeball flowers to going into a giant thing of moldy cheese. Just goes all over the place. And that's not a bad thing per se, but looking at just how well focused the theming was in the rest of the game, this feels like an odd one out. Again, I don't know this for certain, but it almost seems like they had a bunch of cool ideas they didn't know where else to stick, so they decided to tack on one more world at the end to get them all out into the game. I also have to say, from a strictly design perspective, it feels almost too easy to fall to your death. I know that's kind of the idea, you're up in the clouds, but at the same time I wish there were more safeguards where one false step wouldn't send you careening to an inevitable death. I probably died more on Cloud Cuckoo Land than any other level, with the exception of maybe Hailfire Peaks, but more on that later. So overall, not a bad level. Some of the jiggies are infuriating. I'm looking at you, Canary Mary. But overall, just the lack of focus hinders its overall quality more than anything else. Number 6 goes to Hailfire Peaks. First of all, I love the idea. It's a really cool spin on the fire and ice motif that you always see. You know, you always see a fire level, you always see an ice level, but how often are they juxtaposed in such a unique way? The biggest problem I see with this particular level, though, is just the overabundance of environmental dangers. It seems like everywhere you go and everything you do, you're running into problems. You know, be it the floating devil creatures that are trying to hit you, or slipping around on ice, or there being way too much lava. It just seems like everywhere you go, you're taking fire. More so than any other level, you're just constantly under attack, be it from enemies or from the environment. The puzzles themselves are a lot of fun, though. Like, for example, I loved the first time I played this game, just experimenting with the different ways to get between the worlds and how that affects the puzzles. If not for constantly having to dodge these environmental hazards, it would be much higher on this list because I do very much enjoy it. It just once again feels like you're constantly under fire, you're constantly taking hits from different enemies. Something I do appreciate about this game are all of the nods to the previous game. You see Boggy the polar bear, you see Gobi the camel, you see these characters and you hear this music at one point from the previous game, and I really enjoy that little Easter egg. But overall, just the sheer amount of environmental hazards in this particular level feels almost unfair at times. Like, you're constantly dodging fire from all these different kinds of enemies. You're constantly slipping around. You're constantly trying not to, you know, freeze your cojones off in the ice world. There's just too many enemies and too many environmental hazards for it to be as fun as it could be. It feels almost like they overdid it with this particular level. Number 5 was tricky. Simple fact of the matter is, I absolutely love number 5, but I needed a number 5 spot, and I have a lot to say about 1 and 2 in particular. So as such, I needed a number 5 spot, and that's going to go to Mayahem Temple. It's a very effective first world. It does a good job of bringing you back into the proper action of a Banjo-Kazooie-esque world. My only serious complaint with this level is the difficulty. I'm well aware that this is the first level of the game. It's not meant to be super challenging, but it just feels too easy. Like, the jiggies are just kind of casually laying out there, with really only one exception. All you gotta do is go to an NPC, talk to the NPC, and do something quick. Most of the other jiggies in the game feel earned. With this, it almost feels like the game is just handing you jiggies, and it feels a little too easy. Really, the only jiggy that feels genuinely earned in this level is the snake. For many years, I hated the giant snake. That was one of the hardest parts of the entire game for me. I've only just really gotten good at that as a cynical adult. But other than that, none of the other jiggies really feel earned. It almost feels like the first 5 or 6 jiggies in the game, all coming out of here, feel like gimmies. The boss battle is a lot of fun, I gotta say that. But overall, it just feels way too easy. Mumbo's Mountain in Banjo-Kazooie did a very good job of making you feel like you earned these jiggies, despite the fact it was the first level of the game. There was still a certain level of puzzle solving to be able to get to most of them. Anyway, for the sheer lack of difficulty, whether or not it's the first level of the game, Mayahem Temple is at number 5. Number 4 is going to go to Grunty Industries. It's funny, as a kid, this was my least favorite level. But as I've grown up, I've come to appreciate just how unique and how original this particular level is. That gritty industrial vibe is something you didn't see a whole heck of a lot of in video games at this time. You know, especially with Nintendo games, the games tended to be bright and colorful, so to have such a gray level was really kind of interesting. I also appreciate just how much effort goes into opening up the factory. Like, getting access to every nook and cranny of this big factory feels like a puzzle in and of itself. And half the fun of the level is taking the time to explore and figure out how to get from point A to point B. You know, whereas Jolly Roger's Lagoon feels like a major challenge to get anywhere, Grunty Industries manages to make going around the world into an event, makes it into a really fun challenge. The big thing that's keeping it at number 4, however, are the puzzles. Some of the puzzles are really fun, and some of them are absolutely infuriating. And a lot of them dance that fine line between being fun and being tedious. For example, the Clinker's Cavern minigame was basically a recycle of the minigame in Glitter Gulch Mine, and to me it just isn't quite as fun just for how tricky it is. Like, identifying and finding every single one of these clinkers, or whatever they're called, just feels tedious. Whereas it felt very satisfying to do it in Glitter Gulch Mine, here it just felt exhausting. On the flip side of that, the race against time you have to do to access the boss battle feels incredibly satisfying. As a kid, I spent almost a week on this, and when I finally accessed the boss battle, I felt on top of the world. So you have two extremes. You have the painfully tedious, and you have the extremely satisfying in the same level. And for that inconsistency, I put Grunty Industries at the number 4 spot. The top 3 all largely have their rank because they take concepts that should be cliche in gaming, and they manage to put such an original spin on them that they feel original. Number 3 is a great example of this. You know, how many times have you seen some form of an amusement park as a video game setting? I mean, you see it in Fallout, you see it in Carnival, you see it literally everywhere. But with Witchy World, they managed to make it so particularly dystopian that it feels original and it feels fun. To me, there's a relatability factor. I feel like everybody's been to an amusement park or a carnival or whatever, and we're disappointed on some level. So I feel like there's a certain level of relatability here as well. You also see several of the best mini games in the game here, which fits perfectly with the amusement park vibe. You'd expect there to be some carnival games. I love taking my chances with Madame Grunty's tent. The boss battle is fun and original. And frankly, overall, this is just a very well-designed level. This is how an amusement park should be represented in a video game, instead of just taking a bunch of wild, weird themes and cramming them all into the same area. The moves you learn here are a lot of fun too. You know, you finally get to see Banjo and Kazooie split up, you finally get to get that dynamic going on. And overall, the difficulty feels like a very natural progression from the previous level. It feels like things are escalating in a very organic way. So all these things working together, Witchy World takes the spot for number 3. In a similar vein, number 2, Glitter Gulch Mine, does a really good job of taking an old cliche, this time the cowboy western theming, and putting a really interesting, almost industrial twist on it by making it focus exclusively on a mine. I mean, there is so much potential in mining, and they do a really good job of tapping into it, no pun intended. You know, one of my favorite jiggies in the entire game is when you levitate the big jiggy rock into the crushing shed and you have to collect the individual bits. And very similar to Witchy World, it feels like a very natural, very organic progression. You know, coming off of Mayahem Temple where everything feels a little too easy, there's a fair amount of challenge in here. I remember the minigame where you had to grab the quick shoes and sprint all the way across the level really quick. Took me a lot of tries to get down. It's not as easy as it looks. You know, the race with Canary Mary is another personal favorite of mine. The Dynamite Stick minigame is a personal favorite of mine as well. And overall, it just feels very satisfying. And it's hard to put into words, but there's a certain satisfaction when you manage to get to this level and you manage to complete some of the jiggies. These jiggies feel earned a lot more than they do in Mayahem Temple, and I think that might just be the reason. This is probably the most original transformation in the entire game too. And I love the risk-reward of essentially being a detonator, where you have to ask yourself, is it worth taking damage myself to bring this enemy down, or do I try to evade them? Like, to me, that in and of itself automatically elevates the level as a whole above a lot of the other ones. So, for sheer originality alone, Glitter Gulch Mine gets the number 2 spot. And now, by process of elimination, my #1 pick for the best world in Banjo-Tooie goes to Terrydactyland. Terrydactyland has long been my personal favorite world. Even as a kid, it was the one world I was always the most excited to get into and start interacting with. Looking at it now as a somewhat cynical adult, to me, it is the ultimate example of what a Banjo-Tooie world should be. It takes a really cliche concept, dinosaurs, and puts a really interesting spin on it. You know, making these cavemen and these dinosaurs interact in-game really shows just how organic and natural the concept is. The puzzles are very satisfying. One of my favorite jiggies in the entire game is the stomping planes, for example. Boss battle is a little easy, but really fun. And the puzzles feel very, very satisfying. There's not a single puzzle in the game that I don't enjoy. In particular, one thing that stands out to me is the shrinking and growing dynamic with the help of Mumbo Jumbo, wherein certain things in the game need to be made bigger or larger to completely change the game. Be it you transformed as a T-Rex, you know, the baby dinosaurs, the platforms in the swamp. And to me, that shows just how much potential there is for fourth dimensional thought within the Banjo games. It shows just how dynamic and how unique these puzzles can be. So one more time, Terrydactyland takes the top spot, not only for being a very original game, but for having some very unique puzzles and some very unique twists on its puzzles. Looking at this list, a lot of the issues I raise about these levels honestly feel like nitpicks more than anything else. None of these levels are straight up broken. None of these levels are straight up bad. And to me, that's a good perspective on just how well designed these levels are. The people that made these levels clearly put a lot of time into making sure that they were well designed and that they were very original. And to me, that's a perspective on one of the things that makes the Banjo games so special. The fact that there was so much love put into these games. The fact that there was so much effort put into every last detail of these games. The fact that several decades later, we're still talking about these games in such high esteem, and the only serious complaints most gamers can come up with are minor nitpicks like this. It's a perspective on just how much work went into making high-quality games, and that truly does show. Anyway, I hope you guys liked this video. I have some more Banjo content coming down the pipeline, but for now, I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving, and I hope everybody has a great holiday. Thank you for watching.